Today's session is about trade negotiations, and I'd say that's sort of nominally about trade negotiations. It looks like we have three interesting papers that take kind of different methods and study different questions, so I think it'll be a different, a kind of interesting mix of flavors in terms of what people are doing. And so Karen Thierfelder will be talking about U.S. disengagement from the world, what that would look like. Carlos Rita will be talking about the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and Quentin Hunyon will be talking about African firms and their response to Chinese competition. So it seems like it's going to be an interesting session, and I think we can start with you, Karen.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me share my screen. There we go. And there. Hopefully that looks okay. Well, thank you for having me today. This is work. I have a long history of working with Sherman Robinson. I started my career looking at the first NAFTA and opening up to trade, and now we're looking at the U.S. moving away from open trade. So that's a interesting and unfortunate turn of events. But this is, again, work I've done with Sherman at the Peterson Institute. It's work in progress. I appreciate any comments, any criticism. I have thick skin, so I'm happy to take constructive criticism to help us move forward, and I appreciate all of your comments. All right, so I'm going to move you, Russell, there. All right. So first, to comment on some trends that people are probably very familiar with looking at recent U.S. trade policy. It was bad 4 years for the U.S. under the Trump administration. A lot of America first. We saw numerous trade wars, the U.S.-China trade war with the European Union. We saw industries being protected in the U.S., so steel and aluminum have tariff protection. Autos are the next up for protection in terms of the Section 232, the national security argument to protect industries. We saw damage to the World Trade Organization, so through U.S. interactions, it froze the appellate system. Again, we weaponized components of U.S. trade law, so these Section 201, 232, and 301s, different aspects of U.S. trade law that would enable the president to impose tariffs, and they have been used fairly widespread. There was an interesting discussion earlier this morning about the U.S. And pulling out of TPP and implications there. So again, we pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The new agreements we've entered into we've been more protectionist than we were. Biden administration, Congress still seem to have a Buy America emphasis with trade, so we've continued some of the Trump tariffs. China is seen as a competitor or a threat. As Emily commented yesterday, looking at national security arguments to internalize global value chains, and there's a fact sheet that the administration has put out announcing that there's efforts to move these global value chains in-house. For 4 critical products, they identify semiconductor manufacturing, large capacity batteries, like those that go into electric cars, critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals. So there's, again, continuing the threat of Buy America. On the positive side, the U.S. has re-engaged with the World Trade Organization and some of its allies. Oops. In the longer run, so looking at kind of the broad picture, looking at U.S. disengagement, you can see a trend of the U.S. retreating from trade openness. And that's a comment, discussion in an article by Adam Posen in Foreign Affairs, recent edition, May, June 2021. On the one hand, the U.S. has a large, diverse economy. We're separated by oceans from other regions, so it would make sense that our trade openness, or the share of trade relative to GDP, is lower than on average. But the trend is what he's commenting on, which is a bit disturbing, is that we're not opening at the same rate as other countries. So since 2000, for example, the US, we've had trade agreements, but with very small countries, Bahrain, Jordan, Colombia. So it has had little impact on our openness. And even some of the other agreements have been more managed than free trade. So within Chorus, the Korea-US free trade agreement, there was some protection for light manufactured trucks. Within the renegotiated NAFTA USMCA, it's more protectionist for autos. So again, we're seeing a movement away from trade openness. We're seeing pulling away from the global economy in other regards. So with regard to foreign direct investment, Posen notes that greenfield investment, so that's foreign companies setting up a factory in the US that would employ, generate jobs, things like that, has declined from 13 billion in 2000 to 4 billion in 2019. Immigration is a hot topic in the US these days, and of course we've seen evidence of a decline in net immigration, weaker pull because there's an anti-immigrant sentiment in the US, weaker push factors, so wages in Mexico have gone up, and so there's less incentive to try to migrate to the US. And again, the Posen article comments on how that the immigration population has declined over the last 3 decades. On the political side, trade is incorrectly blamed for some structural changes in the US. For example, falling employment in manufacturing is incorrectly or attributed to trade when there are probably a lot of other factors explaining that. And Ann Kruger has a nice new book on international trade, what everyone needs to know. And so that's some discussion of the incorrect attribution of manufacturing decline to trade is in her book. All right, so what is the rest of the world doing while the US has been retreating? Well, globalization has generally expanded around the US. And so from 1990 to 2008, there was a dramatic rise in the global trade share. Again, the US was below the world average. There was a decline with the financial crisis. The world slowly corrected after 2010, in contrast to the US, which had a slower recovery and a gradual decline after 2010. So again, that pattern that the US is retreating in terms of trade openness. There are lots of new trade agreements out there. So TPP went forward. The 11 countries negotiated CPTPP. More countries have expressed interest, such as the United Kingdom. We see RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, with 15 countries in East and Southeast Asia. There have been a plethora of new EU bilateral trade deals. Since 2000, I think the EU has added 13 new member countries, so again, expanding. Many sessions on this conference on Africa and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which has it's largest in terms of countries involved. So again, that trend to globalization and also strong support for the World Trade Organization. So that's the context we're looking in, or we're starting from. And then to think about how to organize the data and how to organize our analysis of results, we're thinking in terms of what we call interconnected regional economies. And so we can define them as a collection of countries with deep integration, deep networks of trade relations, and higher trade shares within the group than countries outside of the region. And we do this, we do this more rigorously, and that's described in a different paper. Here I'm going to use the ICREs as kind of a way to organize looking at results. And so evident in the trade data, we see a grouping of NAFTA countries, US, Canada, and Mexico. East and Southeast Asia, although there's no formal broad agreement, we've seen a trend to increased integration among those countries. So rapid growth in the 1960s, Australia, New Zealand, China, and other poor countries have evolved into kind of an integrated economy. And of course, Europe with the EU 27, the United Kingdom, and other European countries. And again, it was interesting in Emily's talk yesterday. the regions that we've described here are consistent or aligned with the regional global value chains Emily commented on and linked to the paper by Baldwin and Freeman. No other regions qualify in terms of the definition of measuring these ICREs. So we have Mercosur, we have SACU, but they're not interconnected the way NAFTA, East and Southeast Asia, and Europe are interconnected. And to give you a picture of the interconnection, here we have it in the data. And so here we're looking at bilateral trade, as a share of global GDP. Hopefully you can see that. I think I just moved my cursor to the wrong spot, so it messed up the title. So again, the aggregates are NAFTA, Europe, East and Southeast Asia. Those are the interconnected regional economies. And then we have all other countries. Within NAFTA, we broke out the US and rest of NAFTA. And Europe, the components that we're using in the model, we have the EU 27, United Kingdom, and rest of Europe. And the point I want to make from this slide, and this is using GTAP 10 data, so it's 2014. And the point that I'd like to look at here is the interconnected regional economies are all pretty balanced in terms of shares of global GDP. So 26.7 for NAFTA, 25 for Europe, 27 for East and Southeast Asia. But the trade story is very different. So NAFTA accounts for 14% of total exports, Europe 35%, and East and Southeast Asia 29, almost 30%. So relatively even in size, but different in terms of trade patterns. Now, one thing you might notice in the data is that Europe trades a lot with itself. So there's a lot of intra-regional trade there. Less so for the NAFTA countries. Again, this is looking at their bilateral trade among themselves as a share of total trade, total global trade. And there's some in East and Southeast Asia. And so another way to look at this is to say, all right, well, let's net out the within region trade and just see how important each of these aggregates are in the global economy. And so that's what we've done here. And I'm sorry, do you see just my PowerPoint, or do you see what's on my screen with the stop sharing and stuff?
Just your PowerPoint.
This is the PowerPoint.
Mine is too cluttered, and I'm hoping so. Fine, you see the good stuff. So what we did in this slide is we just took out NAFTA, trade with NAFTA, Europe's trade with itself, and East and Southeast Asia's trade with itself, and then looked at the total global trade net of these amounts, and again figured out how important each region is in the world. So NAFTA still is about 14% of total global exports. Europe goes down a bit, but it's still higher than NAFTA, and East and Southeast Asia go down a bit. And so just to summarize these points, NAFTA accounts for 14% of world trade. Europe is first with 35%, and East and Southeast Asia second with about 30%. So the US is not big in the global economy. Maybe after World War II, we were kind of a hegemon, but that's not the case anymore. Europe doesn't depend much on other regions. It trades a lot within the ICRE. But even when we looked at the net trade, US is still pretty low. And then when I break out and I look at each country's, so these are the countries we're going to use in the model. These are aggregates of GTAP 10 data. When we look at thinking about these interconnected regions, NAFTA, Europe, East and Southeast Asia, the blue arrows indicate that these are kind of the export platforms in the region. So the US, our exports are pretty evenly distributed across the other aggregates that we have, across NAFTA, Europe, and East and Southeast Asia. China and Hong Kong, a similar pattern. So it's 24% to NAFTA, 20% to Europe, slightly higher within the region, so 31%, and then about 25% to other countries. Other groups, other countries within the ICREs depend primarily on the region. So rest of North America sends 66% of its exports to NAFTA. If I broke that out to Mexico and Canada, Mexico is very dependent on export sales to NAFTA. Within Europe, EU 27, 60% of their exports go to within the interconnected region of Europe. High numbers for the for the United Kingdom and for other Europe. And then within East and Southeast Asia, Japan, 52% roughly of their exports go to the region. Other high-income Asia and other Southeast Asia are very dependent on the region. And again, that's going to matter when we look at the results and what the impact is. All right, so given that context, what are we going to do? We're going to simulate US disengagement from the global economy. We're going to use GLOBE, which is a multi-country, multi-sector CGE model. We're using GTAP 10 data of year 2014. And we're going to do scenario analysis. So what if the economy changed in a certain way? And again, these are conditional projections. They're not forecasts. And so we're going to model the US withdrawal and the response using a tariff equivalent as the shock. So we're going to increase all tariffs by 30 percentage points. That's a rough guide. I mean, really, the trade policy changes are more nuanced. It's hard to model, I think, the Buy in America campaign. And so best we're going to do is increase all tariffs by 30 percentage points to kind of show that we're moving away from global products. We're going to assume we have full employment and no trade productivity links. That gives us very small GDP effects on full employment. We're interested in the trade diversion, how the global trade patterns adjust. There are important trade productivity links when you break global value chains, but we're not going to get into those in this discussion. We'll have a balanced macroeconomic closure. So when I look at investors or government or households as agents in the model, the policy shock will impact each of them such that they maintain their base share of value final demand or absorption. So it's kind of, the point of that is it kind of evenly distributes the shock, well, not evenly, but it distributes the shock across the actors in the economy, and they have different spending patterns. So that's kind of an important inclusion, I think. Global value chains, we're going to have low import substitution elasticity. So we have imports as an aggregate are substitutable with domestic goods, and they're not very good substitutes because autos has autos and parts, and then with these global value chains, those imported goods are not very good substitutes for domestic goods. Among our trade partners, we're going to have higher substitution elasticities. So it's easier to substitute among your trade partners. We're not going to worry about, it's a comparative static model. We're not going to worry about the transition of how do we go from before to after, or how long is after. We're not going to think about adjustment costs. We're not going to think about macro shocks in trade. So we're going to fix trade balances rather than thinking about US borrowing more from the rest of the world or anything like that. We're going to ignore those issues. And again, we're going to focus on the changes in the structure and the volume of trade. Just a pure trade diversion story. We want to ask what happens when the US disengages, what does it do to the global economy, and what is the impact on the US economy? And so for our scenarios, we're going to have, in all cases, the US increases tariffs by 30 percentage points. Other countries don't change anything among themselves. They don't raise tariffs among themselves. And again, we'll have the full employment, no productivity changes, and no changes in trade balance. And so in the first scenario, that's all we have. Nobody responds. The US raises tariffs 30 percentage points. Then we get more disengagement. So then all trade partners also withdraw from the US, and they raise their tariffs on all products just for the US 30 percentage points. And then finally we say, furthermore, there's a non-US FTA. So everybody, tariffs against the US have gone up, but among themselves, they've gone to zero. So again, these are really stylized scenarios, and we're using the model more as a measuring tool in this situation.
2 minutes, Karen.
Oh, gee. Okay, thank you. And so one thing we want to look at, well, I'll just focus on the third scenario. So that's our complete disengagement. Everybody's exports to the US go down. So I guess not a surprise there. What's interesting is one of the interesting things is rest of North America. They try hard. They export more to other regions, but they go down with the ship. The net effect is a reduction in their exports. Big gains to East and Southeast Asia. That's where exports are going to, East and Southeast Asia. And global trade goes down less than 2% as a result. So it's not a dramatic decline in global trade, just dramatic if you're in the NAFTA region. And so kind of the summary points here, our results are conservative because we're ignoring the efficiency losses that come from moving away from global value chains. What's going on in the US? Well, we're really hurting agriculture and manufacturing products. And so you can see just when the US raises tariffs, a dramatic decline in production with an expansion of services. And then generally the pattern becomes more extreme as we further disengage. So in some sense, we're focusing on the non-traded sectors. And so again, briefly to summarize, there are major changes in the structure of US production. All manufacturing sectors lose. There are indirect linkages, intermediate inputs get more expensive as part of the issue. We find that disengagement hurts both imports and exports, and really the rest of the world can adjust around us. There's very little change in global trade volume and modest trade diversion. I'll stop there, so I'm within Ginger's time limits, and I'm happy to take questions, comments, criticism. This is work in progress, so I appreciate all input.
Okay, thank you, Karen. I guess I'll start with a question and other people can be thinking.
Okay.
So I guess the first question I had was just sort of, I wasn't quite sure what you meant. You had two different, your discussion of elasticities. You had low elasticities in supply chains. And so what does that mean exactly in this context?
Thank you. I should have put a tree diagram up to explain. So we have composite consumption, the CES aggregate of imports and domestic. And at that level, low elasticity for everybody, trying to represent the value chains. And then imports are an aggregate of imports from all partners. So there's a second level to the nest. And so I have a CES function when I import from rest of NAFTA or the United Kingdom. Those have very high elasticity, so they're good substitutes. Probably worth doing some sensitivity analysis, which we haven't done in much detail, but we do find if I have a high substitution elasticity between aggregate imports and domestic, then we get less dramatic changes in the US because we don't need the imports. We can make the goods domestically and manufacturing isn't hurt as much. But I don't think that's realistic. I think with these global value chains, they really are different goods, imports versus domestic. But I will add a diagram to explain that better. And these, of course, don't rely on any elasticities. It's just kind of using the model as a measure. And that's another area where we could improve work by putting some elasticities in.
Yeah. Okay, I had another question. It seemed 30% tariff seems large to me. And I was kind of wondering, so first of all, why so large? And I don't know, do you have any estimate of what the optimal tariff might be? And you might, that would be the kind of peak of what the US would do.
Interesting. 30% So everybody's tariffs, if it was 0, it's now 30%. If it were 5%, it's now 35%. So we just went large. I guess thinking aluminum and steel, they were proposed to be 25%. So we kind of took that as a rough guidepost. But again, that was arbitrary. We're just using it as a measuring device. And we could, again, probably could do some sensitivity analysis around that.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Go ahead.
the Buy America, at least, there's different versions of Buy America, but one version, at least in transportation equipment, is there has to be a 25%, the foreign bid has to be 25% lower. So if you're thinking about Buy America, 25 or 30% is not crazy, I guess, because that seems to be what the tariff equivalent is, as far as I could tell. But anyway, 30 struck me as a little big, but you're doing big picture stuff, so.
Okay, well, yeah, I'll look for some of those more detailed studies about Buy America to try to supplement this. The optimal tariff would be fascinating to look at, and we don't use the model to optimize. That's a whole different story. We do find when it's only the U.S. imposing tariffs, of course, they have a terms of trade gain, so you get something related to the optimal tariff story, but we haven't tried to optimize to find what the optimal tariff, assuming no retaliation. But that would be fascinating to look at.
Are there other questions? Anybody? If not, I have one more.
Okay, thanks.
So when I think about U.S. trade policy, I think of, that probably it's a foreign policy tool. And after World War II, we were engaged as a part of knitting together a community of market economies and things like this. We saw it as a tool for that. And when communism ended, then we kind of began to disengage. And so if I thought of that as kind of the broad picture, if there's a foreign policy threat that would motivate U.S. policy, it's probably China, and TPP was part of that. So I just wondered if you wanted to think about that scenario, maybe that's another paper, but China being part of this Southeast Asian bloc is definitely not what U.S. policymakers want, I think. So that might be worth kind of thinking about in terms of a grand strategy.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And we've thought about that some in our, thinking of this as kind of beginning of a research project, but that makes a lot of sense to think about China and ways to use trade policies to combat that threat is a good way to put it. So yeah, thank you.
I don't see any other questions. So I think we can thank Karen for a great talk and move on to the next one. So thank you, Karen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next talk will be by Carlos Sarita. I have a little interest in this paper, as you'll see from the title slide. Carlos is a graduate student at Purdue, and he's going to be speaking to us on the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is the only kind of successful part of the Doha round so far, and so he'll be talking about that. So over to you, Carlos.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hilberty. Let me just share my. All right. Can everybody see the slides? Okay. So my name is Carlos Rita. I first want to thank GTAP for this wonderful opportunity and the wonderful conference that they put together. So today I will be presenting a paper titled Committed Behavior in the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement. This is a paper that I wrote with Dr. Russell Hilberry. Here we analyze a novel multilateral agreement in the World Trade Organization, as I will show right from the first slide. And we're going to do a formal quantitative analysis of the country's commitment behavior. So first, as a motivation, as Dr. Hilbery mentioned, the Doha round has entered its 20th year, and there has been little progress, but there is one exception, which is the successful negotiation and ratification of the Agreement on Trade Facilitation, which I will call just the TFA. So this agreement entered into force in 2017, and it aims to make the logistics of international trade simpler and less costly, right? Just providing like a lengthy list of practices, procedures, provisions that countries should eventually implement. So developed countries in the TFA are assumed to have full implementation, but then developing country governments, when they sign this agreement, they may choose a subset of the total package of commitments that it is prepared to implement, right? So this is a novelty in this multilateral agreement, and we call it just an a la carte approach, right? Since countries, we can think of them as choosing from a menu, and it represents an alternative to an alternative framework to WTO multilateral agreements concluded with a single undertaking. So single undertaking was that notion that you chose all the provisions of an agreement as a whole, right? Okay, so we use a new database of commitments. This database, I think it was made available around 2017, 2018. This database was made during the process of ratifying the TFA to study, and we use it to study the variation in countries' commitment behavior. And we focus on the so-called type A commitments. These type A commitments are those that countries have agreed to have in place within 1 year of the entry into force of the TFA. Like there are other two types of commitments. There are type B and type C commitments. Type B basically means that a country has asked for more time to implement a particular provision. And type C, the country asks for more time and financial assistance. But those type B and C commitments, they're mostly like promises that something will be implemented. So here we'll just analyze type A. And we have three major questions. The first one is, what is the perceived relative difficulty of implementing the TFA commitments? And to answer this, or to try to answer this, we use implementation levels. Our second question is, what is the relationship between the number of commitments made and the different country characteristics? And to answer this, we use cross-country regressions. And our final question is, what is the nature of the cross-country variation in the kinds of commitments made, right? So this is a different questions from the number of commitments made, okay? So it could be, for instance, that landlocked countries, they have a different set of challenges that they have to face. And so all landlocked countries make specific commitments compared to countries that have a coastline. So to answer this, we use a factor analysis model called multidimensional scaling. So a little bit more about the data. The data that we use to document the type A commitments is taken from the Trade Facilitation Agreement database. This is a new database published by the WTO. And the nice thing about this database is that it contains a detailed breakdown of country commitments. It generates data for 238 commitments across the 12 articles of Section 1 of the TFA. So one commitment is roughly one paragraph of the TFA. So as you can see, it's pretty detailed. And we generate data for 113, we have data for 113 developing countries. Also, we use a broad number of country characteristics, such as the level of income, openness, geographical features, aid for trade, disbursements received, and so on, that we use, especially in the cross-country regressions and later in the multidimensional scale. Okay, so to answer the first question, we calculate something that we call implementation levels. So an implementation level is just the share of all TFA commitments implemented as type A, right? So it has a very simple formula given in equation 1, is the number of commitments made divided by the total number of commitments possible. And we calculate these shares for all articles and areas of regulation. So all the 238 commitments, they could either be grouped by articles But also the Trade Facilitation Agreement Facility, which is another webpage, has organized all of the commitments into areas of regulation depending on the topic they try to address. So the variation in this implementation levels may be informative about the difficulty of each area or article, each area of regulation or each article, right? So there could be some areas of regulation that just require like minimum procedural changes. But then there are other areas of regulation that may require like a high IT infrastructure, and some countries may not have the ability to implement those at the moment. So this leads me to table 1. Here I have shown the type A commitments implementation levels by article number. And the numbers in red, well, first, at the top part, you can see that Article 9 has an implementation level above 80%. And this is related to movement under customs control. I will speak more about this area of regulation in the next slide. And then the article with the lowest implementation level is advanced rulings. So advanced rulings is basically this notion that an importer can obtain information about the tariff classification, and this information has to be binding also about the origin of the product before it arrives to the country. However, we can also organize commitments into areas of regulation. This is a more detailed classification, and so this leads me to table 2. So table 2 shows the commitment implementation levels by areas of regulation. So here again, we see that movement under customs control has above 80% of implementation level. And the area with the lowest implementation level, a little bit above 20%, is single window. So movement under customs control, it relates to the ability of trading firms to move goods from the port of arrival to an inland customs office. So basically, you're allowing the firm to clear a good not in the port of entry, but you're allowing it to clear the good in an inland customs office. So that seems to be, well, if we analyze the implementation levels, we see that most countries have implemented those commitments, and so they might be easier. On the other hand, single window, it's an area of regulation that allows trading firms to interact with all government agencies through a single electronic portal. So we can think that to establish a single electronic portal, it requires a high IT infrastructure. And also, since we want interaction with all government agencies, these agencies, they have to be coordinated. They have to be coordinated. So perhaps that's something that it's more difficult to implement, especially some countries may not have the IT infrastructure ready for implementation. All right. Then, to explain cross-country variation in the number of commitments made, we specify this following equation, equation 2, that we're going to estimate it via OLS. So here the dependent variable is the number of type A commitments made. We call this variable A. And here beta is a vector of coefficients, and xi is just a vector of country characteristics, geographical features, income per capita, population, etc. And epsilon is just a normally distributed error term. So before I go to the regression results, I want to show you this graph. It shows the number of type A commitments made by country versus the log GDP per capita, right? So here, each point in the graph, it's the country ISO code. And you can see that there is an upward relationship, like a positive relationship, between the log GDP per capita and the number of type A commitments, right? So we would expect that countries that have a higher GDP per capita also make more type A commitments. Another thing that you can see from this graph is that there's also a lot of variability, right? So there are some countries that may have a higher GDP than others, but still they're making less commitments. Okay. These are the regression results in table 3. Some of the variables that we're using in these models, they could be highly endogenous to the trade facilitation, well, to the number of trade facilitation commitments implemented. So we have included the most endogenous variables sequentially, leaving the most endogenous last. Okay, so the first model that we estimate just contains log GDP per capita. And you see that throughout all the models, log GDP per capita, which is our proxy for per capita income, has a positive and significant effect throughout all the models that we estimate. So basically, we see here that an additional log point in GDP per capita will increase the number of commitments made by about like 35 to 40 units. This is a lot of increase that needs to take place in order for to achieve that. So an additional log point is almost like doubling GDP for a country. And we also see in the number in blue in the left, in the lower left corner, that only including log GDP per capita will explain about like 36% of the total variation in the number of type A commitments made. Another thing that you should notice is that the log GDP per capita coefficient reduces in the last two models, and this is when we include controlled corruption. I will explain possibly why this happens, why this possibly happens as I continue with my explanation. The next coefficient of interest is log population. So we see that one additional log point in population increases the number of type A commitments made by about 8 to 11 additional commitments. So again, it means like we need to double the population of a specific country for it to have like 10 additional commitments. So I think an important point that we should make here is that GDP per capita and population, we can think of them as variables that they increase slowly with time. So this means that possibly reaching full implementation of the TFA might be something difficult, or they might be well into the future. Okay, the next variable that we see that has a significant negative effect is this core variable. So this core variable is an indicator if a country belongs to a core group. So the core group were a group of about 21 countries that they were opposed to the TFA during negotiations. And they said that basically developing countries, they may not be ready to implement all commitments. And so they asked for flexibility in the implementation. And here we see that basically if a country belongs to this core group, it's making around like 35 to 36 fewer commitments than otherwise. So basically their behavior after negotiations is still consistent with what their behavior during negotiations. Okay, and this leads me to the last variable that I want to analyze, which is the ability to control corruption. So this variable, we have taken it from the World Governance Indicators. And so we see that it has a positive and significant effect. Basically, if we increase the ability to control corruption by 1 unit, that would mean it translates into 29 additional commitments. But you can see that log GDP per capita, the coefficient has reduced once we include this controlled corruption variable from about 36 to 20, 27, 25. So this could mean that possibly controlled corruption and log GDP per capita are also highly correlated. And this makes sense because countries with higher GDP, they may have higher standards in the controlled corruption. Okay. Now, our main dependent variable can only take non-negative integer values, right? So it could be 0, 1, 2, 3, and we could argue that a count data model is probably more appropriate. So in a version of the paper, as a robustness check, we have estimated also the following model given in equation 3 using a negative binomial regression, right? So the difference here is also it's the equational form, but also the error term epsilon is such that the exponential of that error term follows a gamma distribution. This model, the results from this model are consistent with our OLS results, both in terms of the quantitative implications of the coefficients and also the significance of most coefficients. Okay, although it is difficult to establish causality in our context, like we have only 113 data points, some of the variables may be endogenous and we cannot include a lot of variables. Despite that, some of the country characteristics have plausible instruments. So we have re-estimated some of the OLS regressions using two-stage least squares, where we instrument the following variables. So we have instrumented the free trade agreement dummy variables, the openness measure, and the per capita aid for trade facilitation received by each country. So the instruments that we use in these regressions have shown to be generally weak. However, the estimates indicate stronger effects of the aid for trade facilitation per capita on the number of type A commitments made compared to the OLS results, right? So those coefficients may jump to 12, even to 20. Those results are also available if somebody wants to see them repeated. Okay, now to answer a final question, we use multidimensional scaling, which is a technique similar to principal components analysis, but it's applied to binary data. This technique has also been used to study roll call voting behavior in the U.S. Congress, and basically it has helped to position individuals, legislators within a revealed ideological space. And we apply MDS to reduce the dimensionality of our TFA commitment matrix, right? So we can think of our commitment matrix as having a lot of dimensions, right? So 238, and we want to reduce that dimensionality. And then we correlate it with, we correlate the dimensions with country characteristics. So this leads me to my final table of results. Here what we have is the dimensions that we have kept. We have kept 9 dimensions following the Kaiser criteria, where we do the multidimensional scaling. And we see basically that the first dimension explains about 72% of the total variation of distances in the original commitment matrix. And also it's highly correlated. It almost has like a perfect correlation with the number of type A commitments made. So we can say that basically most of the difference along the kinds of commitments, it's just on the number of commitments made. Okay. Now, as conclusions, we have used a new data set to study cross-country commitment behavior in a novel a la carte multilateral agreement framework. From the implementation levels, we have seen that commitments related to movement under customs control and pre-shipment inspection, they appear to be the easiest to implement by developing countries, but single windows and authorized operator programs appear to be the most difficult, right? So especially single windows require like a lot of IT infrastructure. Also, we see that an OLS regression shows that the variation in per capita income alone explains 36% of the variation of the number of commitments made, right? So again, we're talking here only about type A commitments. And the coefficient of the log GDP per capita in the OLS regression shows that each additional log point, or basically doubling per capita income, is associated with 36 more type A commitments. So it means that basically we have to increase the per capita income of a country a lot in order to achieve those additional commitments, plus reaching full implementation of the TFA is difficult. And finally, from the MDS results, we see that there is only modest variation across countries in the preferred content of their commitments once we control for a number of commitments made. So most of the difference between countries is in the number of commitments they have made. Right, so I will stop here. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Yes, so let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Best thing is to turn on your camera, and then we'll know that you have a question. I think you might want to keep your slides up.
Okay.
So I have a question.
Okay.
I think just on the multidimensional scaling,
Okay.
you kind of showed us that. Maybe this is more of a comment. I don't know. You kind of showed us that the number of commitments explains most of the variation across countries.
Yeah.
And I think maybe the point here is that what we don't see, right? So you motivated the exercise by saying, well, landlocked countries might make different commitments than islands or something like that. But that doesn't look like that's what matters, right? It's just sort of how ready are you to make commitments?
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. It means that someday everybody can get all the way to full commitments, I guess. No, but it also kind of means that these number of commitments we already saw it's related to these hard to change variables. So it might be hard for them, as you said, it might be hard for them to. It might take a long time for countries to commit fully. So anyway, I think that was a surprise for me that we didn't see some kind of more heterogeneity across countries, what commitments they made.
Yeah.
Okay, I think one other thing to kind of point out, maybe go back to this figure 1.
Okay.
I don't know if you can see it on the figure, but it's, I think, kind of interesting to note the range of variation in the data, right?
Yeah.
So that those countries up at the top, which includes Singapore and Chile and Mexico and a few others, they're fully implemented, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that those countries, especially in the kind of Pacific area, the countries that you would think of as highly engaged in trade are fully implemented. And then I think the lowest number was 2, right?
Yeah, the lowest was 2, yes.
Some country had made 2 commitments.
Yes.
Sierra Leone, I think it was. Yeah, SLE must be Sierra Leone.
Yeah, Sierra Leone.
And then there's Nepal and some others. So
yeah,
kind of an interesting agreement in that, some countries chose to implement everything and some countries have only just begun. So Karen asks about types B and C. So I don't know, do you want to talk about that? She's wondering, why not study B and C?
Yeah, those we have not analyzed them because they are mostly like promises that they would be implemented. However, there are some plans to analyze this commitment, how it has evolved in time, and to see how countries change from type B to type C. At least from what I've seen in the database, how it has changed, I think from 3 years now, almost 4. Once a country makes a type A commitment, that doesn't change, but type B or type C commitments, they do change. Like a country can make a type B commitment and then say like, oh, I realized I don't only need more time, but I need financial assistance from a developed country to implement this type of provision. Or sometimes it could be that they said at the beginning, oh, I needed financial assistance, but now I realize, you know what, like I just need more time to implement it. And you can see those switch, at least I have seen those switch, how those commitments switch between B and C. But yeah, I think it would be worthy to analyze in a different paper, to be honest, and using panel data, I would say. Didn't see this last.
I don't know if you saw the question in the chat, Carlos.
Yeah, it says, all right, thank you. It says, might have missed the explanation of correlation, especially introducing the population variable in island. So I don't know if, are you referring to this, to the regression results?
Yeah, I think that what he's saying is that when you introduce population, the island coefficient becomes less significant.
Oh, yeah.
So how should he think about that?
I think this is because usually island countries, they have a low population. So basically, it could be that island and population, these 2 variables are highly correlated. So once we include log population, we're just controlling for that. That's how I would say it.
Yeah, you might say that. So the idea was that being landlocked or being an island was sort of a highly exogenous characteristic country, right? That's determined long ago before they were thinking about trade facilitation. And so we put those variables in kind of first, and island shows up. It's sort of interesting that both island and landlocked have negative coefficients.
Yes, yes.
That have shore and borders. But islands have small populations on average, and we think population might also matter, and population is also quite plausibly exogenous to the trade facilitation commitments. And put population in, and that way, I think the way to think about it is if you're running a horse race between population and island status in terms of explaining the number of TFA commitments, population seems to be more important.
Yeah.
Just to kind of expand on that a bit, large countries like India can, running a customs service is difficult, but a very populous country like India can invest the resources to have a sophisticated trade facilitation agreement. I'm sure there are still problems, but whereas small countries just may not have the technical capacity to do these things. So.
Or they can use economies of scale in those commitments. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. May I ask a further question?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like controlling with dummy variable is like island and landlocked, as far as I remember. So what is the difference between a cluster and using I don't know, like I know its observation is quite limited, and I don't know how to use the cluster effect this part, and especially population perspective or island and landlocked. But using a dummy variable to control the island and landlocked, how to capture the reality, capture the population perspective. Thank you.
I think just to be clear, are you talking about clustering as a statistical strategy? Is that what you mean when you say cluster?
Yes, Professor. Since you have a limited number, like observation is quite small, it is not obvious to use the cluster effect probably. But using the dummy variable to interpret the kind of cluster effect, as far as I understand, like population perspective or income perspective, is it to capture the reality?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think what you're saying is that as a econometric technique, when we have these dummy variables, we should be clustering standard errors because the standard errors are not normal when I have a dummy variable. Is that the idea? Yeah, I think it's about statistical technique. I mean, this is we should say this is a very broad brush regression. If we thought of all the causes that could explain commitment behavior, we'd probably exhaust the data. So we're really just painting a picture here with our regression. And I think as far as empirical niceties, one reason that we do the negative binomial is that's probably an important, one effort to address the econometric issues that come up in something like this. But at the end of the day, it's a cross-country regression, so it's not going to be especially pretty. This is just to sort of painting pictures is what we think of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Ginger says that's the last question. That's probably right. We're using up our time here. So thank you very much, Carlos, for the presentation.
Thank you.
The next presentation is by Quentin Pugnon. He's speaking to us about firm level trade in Africa and how it responds to Chinese competition. So it's over to you, Quentin.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Before to start, I want to tell you that my English level is very low. Then I apologize for the many mistakes I will do. My name is Quentin Honyon. I'm a PhD student at Paris. I'm here to present to you my paper, which topic is advance of China's goods into African market in part of film growth. As we know, international trade was between nations for complementarity reason. So we have trade between non-law countries and North-South countries. But since the early 1970s, the trade has developed, and so that we have trade, we have exchange between South-South countries. This type of trader was catalyzed by China accession to WTO in the late of 2001. On this figure, we represented the evolution of world trade over the period 1950 and 2020. From 2000, we can see that the trade has increased sharply. This rapid growth of the world trade can be associated to the China accession to WTO. Why? On this figure, we have represented the share in world exports of the world major player in the trade over the period 2000 and 2018. There's a world major player is our European Union, USA, and Japan. But since 2000, we have also China. We can remark that the share of the old player decreased over the time, while the share of the China increased quickly. It's for this reason we have associated the sharp increase of world trade to China accession to WTO. Now, why we are interested to China-Africa trade? On this figure, we have represented the import share of African main partner. As partner, African countries have two types of trade partner: the old partner and the new partner. The old partner are European Union, USA, and Africa itself, while the new partner are China and India. Since 2000, the import share of the old partner decreased, while the import share of the new trade partner increased. And we can remark that in 2015, the share of China and the European Union are the same. But today, China is the first trade partner of African countries, and also their products are very competitive. It's for this reason we interested to China-Africa trade. According to the literature, China trade with developed countries and developing countries. In the developed countries, China poses a great threat to the firm growth, but stimulates innovation. In the developing countries, there is also a serious threat, but this threat varies across firm characteristics. For instance, the big enterprises and the most capital intensive are often less vulnerable to the China penetration. About African about African countries, there is a lot of quantitative and qualitative analysis at the macroeconomic level, but there are very few quantitative analyses at the microeconomic level. These latter are almost unanimous on the negative impact of the China shock on business performance, but they do not scrutinize the heterogeneity. Then we contribute to the literature by analyzing the effects of the China's industry level shock on a sample of plants across countries and industry over a period encompassing a rapid and large increase of China's exports to African markets. Then we explore three main channels. The first is the penetration of the China's input, the penetration of China's output, and also the penetration of China's products in general in the common third market by distinguish between developing and developed markets. We expect that China would be a threat to Africa manufacturing emissions due to its competition domestically and on export markets. We also expect that China could stimulate competitiveness of African products by allowing access to cheaper imported imports. As main result, we have found that the penetration of China's output on the domestic market led to a significant negative effect on film size. We also found that the penetration of China's inputs led to a significant drop in film soil. Lastly, China penetration into common markets significantly reduces the size of exporting company. This decline is more pronounced in developed markets. In the following, we will present to you our empirical strategy, our estimation results, and some heterogeneity analysis that we did. Before to continue, let me explain you some concepts that we use. We call output products all goods imported but also produced on the domestic market. And here we evaluate its penetration by doing the ratio between import and absorption. This penetration is evaluated at industry level, and the absorption is equal to the sum of final consumption and investment, film investment. We call inputs all imported goods used in upstream by domestic firm. And here to evaluate its penetration, we have followed the approach of Asemo Group that we'll explain later. We have used three main data. The first is Antarctic survey data, which encompasses 3,531 manufacturer firms and distributed, and we have in total 8,162 observations distributed across 28 countries and observed over the period 2001 and 2018. We use also basic data, which encompasses the information at product level. In this database, we have 46 African countries observed over 1995 and 2018. The last data that we use is EURA database, which is national inputs output, which encompasses national input output data. And the information are available for all countries from 1990 to 2015. We use also some macroeconomic indicator, for instance, electricity access rates, to take into account the quality of electricity, since we work on the firm. We have also used exchange rates to standardize all local currency of the country. On this figure, we have represented the evolution of China penetration on African markets. We choose 5 countries that are Egypt, Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Togo. You can remark that China penetration varies across year and across countries. It is important to notify that the African low-income countries have most penetrated comparatively to the other countries. Here we have the penetration of China in the industry level. We can remark that this penetration varies across time, across industry, and within countries. The remark is the same with input penetration. Its penetration varies also across time, across industry in the same countries. In order to evaluate the China's output penetration effects in the film growth, we have followed the approach of Don et al. In the left of this equation, we have film growth, which can be film cell growth or film labor growth. In the right, we have outputs. We have the growth of output penetration. That is here our main interest variable. We include in this equation the penetration of the countries susceptible to challenge China products. Those countries are India and other African countries. We also include in this equation some countries' characteristics susceptible to influence the firm retaliate or the China effect. Finally, to take into account the unobservable heterogeneity, we have included industry dooming, countries dooming, and time dooming. Our interest variable is susceptible to be endogenous. For instance, when there is a positive shock on local demand, this leads to increase of local demand, and this increase can lead to increase of local supply and China's and also import from China's. To take into account this endogeneity problem, we have used the instrument of Don et al. This instrument stipulates that the China's penetration will be the same across similar countries. Then here, to calculate our instrument, we have used over developing countries that have not any economic link with African countries. We continue to use the same model to evaluate the penetration of China's inputs. But here, to calculate China's penetration, we have followed the approach of Acemoglu. This approach stipulates that the penetration of China's input in the industry car is the weighted average of China penetration in all upstream industry that supply inputs to industry car. Here also, we have used the same instruments to correct the endogeneity of this variable. In our last model, we have evaluated the penetration of China into the common market. And here we have to distinguish between two types of markets, the developing market and the developed market. The developed markets are represented by the USA and European countries markets, and the developing markets are represented by the India and African markets. Now let's move to the results. This table shows that China outputs penetration on the African market reduced significantly film SAL. The results are the same in the external market, but the China penetration effect on the developed market is more pronounced than in the developing market. Then the firms that export more to the developed countries are more treated by China shock than the other exporter. In the column 6, we can see that the China input penetration has negative effects on the film SAL. This is surprising, but can be explained by the fact that maybe China inputs are not designed to work efficiently in the African environment. For instance, maybe the China machinery are not able to face electrical shock in Africa. These results show that in general, neither China's outputs nor China inputs are good for African firms. A second way to evaluate the China penetration effect on film growth is to consider the growth of film employment. This table reveals that film employment dropped when China penetration increased on the domestic market, but there is no effect of China penetration growth into common markets. This latter can be justified by the fact that exporter firms are more capital intensive. Then there is not enough employment to destroy. Even if this result is in line with the previous, it is necessary to be careful about them. Indeed, it is possible that the manufacturing job destroyed will be picked up by the service sector or higher in other companies that would not appear in our data, since they are companies that are observed in the first wave but not in the following wave. Since then,
2 minutes, Clinton.
Okay. Since then, we cannot conclude that China penetration creates unemployment in African countries. To have the net effect on employment, the study should be completed with a more aggregated sectoral level analysis. We have done a lot heterogeneity analysis. They show that young, small, and less capital intensive are more vulnerable to China penetration on their market. The big enterprises present a pro-competitive effect. This means that big enterprises retaliate efficiently faced to China penetration. That is possible since in the African market, the big enterprises have more chance to access credit than the small enterprises, and then they can invest and increase their competitiveness easily. So they would be less vulnerable from electrical shock, for instance. We have also found that firms that belong in the rich natural resource countries are more vulnerable, but we will use later another indicator to reclassify countries into rich or poor natural resource countries before to conclude. In conclusion, we can say that based on our results, we can recommend that it is important to provide African companies with a good business climate by helping them access financial credit, good quality of electricity, and a skilled workforce. Our research does not seek to answer to the question, is Sino-African trade beneficial for Africa? Because answering to this question necessitates to have a representative sample of African firms to study the impact on the informal sector and at consumer level. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Quentin. Are there some questions from the floor? Okay, I think I have a question. If you wouldn't mind keeping your slides up, I'd like to draw you back to one of the slides. That's all right. Well, I think the question I had, there was a slide earlier that showed, I think, I don't remember the countries exactly. Maybe it was Kenya and Ethiopia that had seen a lot of penetration by Chinese firms. And then South Africa less, I think. And then some Togo, very little penetration. And I was wondering if you had any view or thinking about why that was. I guess it could be geography, but it could be also trade policy or industrial composition. So why is it that the countries in the eastern part of Africa are seeing so much more penetration than the countries in the western part of Africa and the southern part?
Please, I don't hear you.
Okay, why don't I write in the chat? It's going to take me a little time here. Maybe if others have questions, they could type in the chat as well. That's probably the best way to do this.
Okay, now I understand your question, but I can answer to this question by saying that maybe these two countries has not the same development, the same development level in the manufacture sector. You can see that Togo has more penetrate has more penetrate than Ethiopia. It is important to tell you also that Togo is a lesser developer than Ethiopia. Then Togo, in terms of industrial production or manufacture production, Togo produce less than Ethiopia. It's for this reason that Togo imports more than Ethiopia. I don't know if you understand me.
I hear you. I might have remembered the countries wrong in the slide, but it just was notable that some countries were much more seeing much more penetration than the others, and I thought maybe that was a big source of the variation that is identifying these effects. So I think if that's the case, it's good to explain why there's so much variation across countries.
Okay, but if you want to, but I have some problem to explain you. But if you want, I can send you by writing the answer. I know the answer, but I don't know how to tell you.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. There was a comment in the chat as well. I just wanted to draw your attention to that. Carlos mentioned that there's a new paper on Bartik instruments and a methodological point about that. So I just wanted to draw your attention to that.
Yeah.
Just another comment in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah. It's just, hi Quentin, this is Carlos. It's just that I saw that you have been using the Bartik instruments. When you talk about the Dorn, the instruments used by Dorn, and I think also Otto Dorn and Hansen. So recently there was this new paper. It came out last year, where they analyzed the use of all these instruments. And so since you're using these instruments throughout your paper, you may want to mention this new paper as well, right? I think it's being read by a lot of people, so you may want to check it out, just in case. Okay. Yeah, it basically walks you through how to check the assumptions that you have to that you're using for these Bartik instruments and so on and so forth. So it might be useful, just in case.
You can resume me your question in the chat, please.
Yeah, I have wrote down. It's I also put a link to the paper there, just in case you want to see it.
Okay, are there other questions?
Yes.
No, I'm asking the audience if there are any other questions. I think not. So I think we can sort of wrap up a little bit the talk or the session. So I thought it was really interesting. We had very different questions, and very different methods, and some really big issues. U.S. participation in the world economy and the only trade agreement at the WTO for 20 years, and of course China's interaction with Africa is going to be a really interesting, topic to follow. And probably next year, there'll be a lot more African participation in the conference, and so I expect that we'll get to revisit these again. So that's very interesting work and a very interesting set of questions. Okay, we have one more comment from Onur Beyik. He's asking about panel data and how each country affects the regression outcome. I think this is related to my question, really, is how much of this is coming from one set of countries versus another would be an interesting question to ask. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up the session. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was a very good session, and I hope to see you again in other sessions or maybe next year. And that's it. Goodbye.